Hi, my name is Rory Scanlon. I'm a professor here at Brigham Young University, and one of my areas of study is costume design, particularly for the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Book of Mormon. And I'd like to share some of my feelings and my use of some of the paintings by James Tissot. I'm thrilled that we have those here at BYU and we get to see them in the original formats. The one I'm standing next to right now is the Mess of Pottage, which comes from Genesis 25. One of the things that I do as a costume designer is I'm always looking for material that helps me pull character, that helps me pull detail from period as well. And one of my resource artists that I use a lot when I'm doing anything from the Bible is Tissot, because of his attention to detail and the things that he does. So as I'm developing a character, I'm interested in making comment for audience using some common things that we do in communicating visually. We often put good characters in lighter colors, closer to white, evil characters in dark colors, closer to black. And we also do some other things that I'd like to point out in this painting that Tissot does so well. If we look at Jacob himself as a character, we notice that he is, first of all, in the lighter color. He's in the white color, so he must be the good character in the image that we're looking at here. He also chose to bind him. He's actually girded up his costume about himself, so he's more bodily revealed, which makes him more vulnerable as a character. And that makes him more honest and true to us. But mainly he's in one color, so he stands for something. He's not going to change a lot. He's going to represent himself and stay pretty much that way. In opposition, we look over at Esau and we see that he is just the opposite of his brother. He is, first of all, in darker colors. He's not necessarily evil, but in comparison to his brother, he's not quite as pure and innocent, you might say. What we would say, though, also about Esau is that he's multi-layered, so he's less revealed, he's more covered up, he's more concealed as a character. He's also in a variety of colors and details, which gives him the chance to change and become something else. And we as an audience tend to watch characters that have more color and more detail because we know they're going to evolve as characters. And the story in The Mess of Pottage is the evolution of this character and the choices he's going to make. I'm also interested in the fact that historically he's got influences from other countries in his costume, not just his own country, which tells me he's a man of the world. He's had some experience outside of just the normal homeland, you might say. One thing that I find is very interesting is the emphasis of his costume. Though he's emphasizing lots of different areas, the big emphasis on all the details around his stomach. And we know in the story can find that very interesting, that he chooses to think about his stomach at this time, but that's what the whole story is about, right, in the first place. He does have a lighter color next to his skin, which does allow him to be a little more vulnerable as a character, but you'll notice that Tissot chose to cross over his heart with a couple of straps. So he's closed off his heart to us as an audience as we're talking about him as a character. The last thing that I would mention here is just Tissot's great ability to really use visual communication for the story and what's going on. As we look today in the Western world at art, we look from left to right, just like we've learned to read. So this point on a piece of art is considered most inherent motion. We want to look here and then be carried across the painting. They put inherent motion on the pottage, the actual pottage that he's so interested in. And that's even more emphasized by the stripes in the tent that all flow down and point right to the pottage and emphasize it over again. For the second piece, I'd like to share with you some feelings about Jacob and Rachel at the well. This is from Genesis 29, and the things that pop out to me as I look at this is, first of all, some of the culture that's being represented here. We're talking about people bringing sheep to the well to water them, which is probably more or less a male job to be done. And most of the characters in the image are male, but we have the unusual appearance of a woman at the well. Perhaps, I mean, in story-wise, maybe she doesn't usually come to the well, but today, for some reason, she felt inspired to come to the well. There's a lot of, that we believe, a lot of the cosmos were working to make this relationship work for us, right? So, first of all, we have a couple of males. All three of them, well, all the characters, actually, the clothes closest to their skin is white. So all of them are vulnerable, open to purity and being honest as characters. So as we look at these two major characters, because we can notice the people in the background and get interested in those characters, but our focus is supposed to be on these two major characters in front. First of all, let's look a little bit at Jacob. Jacob has subserviented himself down to do work at the well. Again, he's crossed himself with fabric to help hold his clothes together so he can actually do his work. And then he has lowered himself down below her to take off the opening of the well and do the work to feed the sheep, give the water to the sheep. We might imagine that he's just traveled here and he himself is probably thirsty, but rather than get the water for himself, he's given the water to her and her sheep. He's in full white, again standing for what he believes in. He does have touches of color, but if you look carefully at those colors, they come from the colors that she's wearing, principally around her head, which is interesting. So we might say that in many ways he's of her and very interested, therefore, in her. She is the character that stands out probably the most to us in this painting, particularly because she's got the stronger colors. Now, we would say, wait a minute, doesn't she have the darker colors? And that's not necessarily dark. It's just more color than certainly what he's wearing. She has multiple layers also, but everything that she has is still body revealing. She's still vulnerable as a character. But historically, to follow the culture, she has covered her hair, which is common in the period, for women particularly, because women who did not cover their hair were not considered very nice women in this period. What I find very interesting is she has white closest to her skin, and she's open and revealed in the heart region. So she's open and welcoming in her heart. And that has actually been enhanced because the costume has red bordering the heart. So not only is there white at her heart, there's also red, which shows the passion in the character. The one thing that I find very interesting about this in choice of color, however, is the fact that Tissot chose to put her in blue. And historically, you might recognize the fact that the Virgin Mary was always shown in blue. So there's a relationship between this character and Mary. The last image I'd like to share with you is one of my favorites. This is Joseph reveals his dream to the brethren. We don't know which of the dreams, because he doesn't reveal just one, but he does multiple. And things that I want to bring up in this one is I want to give you a little background in the actual costumes of the period, because this is a great painting to look at for that information. And it also helps reveal the fact that while Tissot was living in the 1800s in the Holy Land to get the information that he wanted, he was taking in information and not understanding that he wasn't necessarily seeing the period as it would have been back in the day of the real Old Testament. There are some changes in these clothes that reveal to us that they're not historically accurate exactly, you might say. So we look at the brothers all around here in the area, and the first costume that they have on is the coutonneuse, which is the undergarment, and it's the exact same garment that was given to Adam and Eve in the garden, the coutonneuse. And we actually take the word chiton or tunic from this word, and that's what it represents, as a kind of a tunic undergarment that everyone wore. When they made these garments, it's not like we do today. We make yards and yards of fabric and then we cut it down to whatever size we want to. And there's another painting in the same collection that's called The Tailor. And he has a character sitting on the floor with a piece of fabric, and he's about to cut a piece of fabric. So it shows that Tissot was telling us that in the period that he was working with the people in the Holy Land, they were making large pieces of fabric and cutting them to the size they wanted. Historically, they wouldn't have done such a thing, because to cut a piece of fabric is to weaken it. Now you suddenly have this raw edge that you have to deal with somehow. In this period, they would have woven every piece, all four sides, on a loom, a ground loom, to make it exactly the size they wanted it. And then they would have pieced it together to make the garment into what they wanted it to be. So a typical coutoneth would have a front piece and a back piece sewn at the shoulders and down the sides, and leaving holes for the arms to come through and the head to come through. It could have been done in one long piece, and then they cut the center to do that and then reinforce that by stitching around it. The major thing that is major different for us is the fact that when they actually stitched those seams together, they overlapped the fabric and actually did the stitch and wanted you to see it, because they wanted you to see that embroidery and all the handwork that goes into it. And in fact, in the tailor, if you actually look at the Hebrew words, because it says that he is working on garments of service, the bigad, the sarad. And the sarad actually means needle going through. So I'm not sure why he didn't do enough research to realize that sarad does not mean cutting some fabric up, but it meant passing a needle through and actually putting the pieces of garments together. So if we look at these garments, particularly if we look at this one brother down here in the very bottom who's wearing an adareth over the top of his coutoneth, so it's an overgarment, you can see the shoulder seams on each of the garment that he's wearing, and because it was woven in more than one piece, it's actually got a waist seam to give it the length that they wanted. But all of his seams are hidden, like we do today. We take our fabric and put right sides together, sew it, and then put that on the inside so no one sees that. In historical period of the Bible, they would have overlapped those, hand-stitched them, and done nice embroidery to let you actually see all the work of putting that together. So it's fun to look at all the different brothers and see some of the way the pieces were pieced together. If they wanted a coutoneth with a longer arm, they would weave those pieces separately, stitch them together, and then add them to the costume, so you'd see a shoulder seam also. As I look at this piece, though, as it tells its story, the thing that puzzles me the first time when I saw it is, why isn't Joseph in his coat of many colors? Because we're all expecting that, right? But he, again, is telling a story, and he's trying to say a few different things. First of all, he's telling us that Joseph is not the same of his brothers, so he doesn't have a coutoneth, which is what the coutoneth was that was given to him, the coutoneth pas, as it's interpreted in the scriptures. In this one, he is in an innocent child's garment. So he's even more vulnerable. And you'll notice it's more body revealing, so he's very vulnerable to his brothers. But I like that Tissot has raised him up above all his brothers in kind of a premonition of what the future is saying and what the dreams actually tell us, that he is going to dominate his brothers. The last thing that I would say a little bit about the entire presentation of this is, again, we look at him and say, wait a minute, he's in the darkest color. And I think that he did that because he wanted him to stand out amongst his brothers. And so he gave him the opposite color. And his color is from the natural fur of the animal that he got it from, without bleaching it out and doing anything to it to make it another color. He's a natural character, you might say. And one last thing I would point out is that one of his brothers has the same piece of fur for his kilt skirt that he's wearing. So perhaps in the storytelling, this might be Reuben, who's going to save him in the end. So I hope that helps a little bit in enjoying some of these paintings and looking for some of the detail. When I am looking for the detail in the costume designs, I look for artists that do give me full detail. A lot of artists today give what we call schmatas. In other words, costumes that have no detail to them. They're just fabric kind of sort of on a body, because they haven't gone to the extent of what Tissot did, of really studying the culture and understanding the clothing of the people.